My name is Joana, and the day I lost my brother John started like any other until he let go of my hand and walked into the middle of the road. What happened next haunted me forever. We were twins, my brother and I, yet so different in personality that it often surprised people that we shared a womb. He was the elder by just a few minutes, but his soft-hearted nature left him vulnerable to the world's harshness. I, on the other hand, felt a sense of responsibility from an early age. It wasn't something I chose, it was something I had to do, especially after we lost our mother. Life as we knew it changed when we were just 11 years old. The day our mother passed away was the day our childhood ended. She was our entire world, a loving, hard-working woman who shielded us from the truth of our father's absence. From what little we had heard about him, he disappeared long before he even knew he would be the father of twins. Whether he ran out of fear or selfishness, we never knew. All we knew was that he wasn't there. Our uncle, Fred, stepped in after our mother's death. He was a kind man, though not without his struggles. He took us in and promised to raise us as his own, even though we knew his finances were tight. His wife, Auntie Grace, however, was a different story. At first, she resented our presence. I could see it in the way her lips tightened when we walked into the room, or how she avoided eye contact when serving us food. But life has a way of softening even the hardest hearts. Over time, she grew fond of us, or at least she grew fond of my brother John. His gentleness won her over in ways I never could. I didn't mind. I wasn't there to win anyone's affection. My focus was on protecting my brother, making sure he felt safe and loved even in this new, uncertain life. Living with Uncle Fred brought challenges. His wife's initial hostility wasn't the only obstacle. There were times we overheard whispers from neighbors, accusing my uncle of taking us in out of pity or obligation. Other times, kids in the neighborhood would mock us for being orphans with no father, as though it was something we chose. Through it all, I kept my head high, for my brother's sake. Despite everything, I can't say those years were entirely bleak. There were moments of joy too, unexpected kindness from strangers, laughter shared between the three of us, and the gradual warmth that blossomed in our new home. My uncle's wife eventually became a mother figure, especially to my brother. She taught him to cook, to sew, and even how to garden. Meanwhile, I focused on finding odd jobs, helping my uncle with chores, and making sure we didn't become a burden. As the years passed, I began to realize something about my brother. His softness wasn't a weakness, as I had once believed. It was a strength, one that allowed him to connect with people in ways I couldn't. While I took on the role of protector, he became the heart of our little family. Together, we found balance. As I said, my brother was very soft. John wasn't just quiet. He was fragile in a way that made me want to protect him with everything I had. He didn't speak out, not even when it was necessary. I thought perhaps it was because of the pain he carried after losing our mother. But even before then, he had always been the quiet one. The difference now was that his silence came with tears. When others lashed out at him, peers, teachers, even strangers, he would say nothing. He wouldn't raise his voice or defend himself. Instead, he would lower his head and let their words or fists land as if he thought he deserved it. I couldn't stand it. So I became his voice, his shield, his sword. When someone tried to mock him, I was there to strike back. If a teacher scolded him unfairly, I spoke up, even when it meant earning a trip to the principal's office. And if any child dared to lay a hand on him, they would have to deal with me, fists clenched, fury burning. I didn't care what it made me look like. Friends were a luxury I couldn't afford. I wasn't a girl. I was a warrior, and he was my only cause. But my brother's softness wasn't just his struggle. It became mine too. It was exhausting, carrying the weight of two people, especially when he wouldn't let me in. He bottled everything up, swallowed his pain whole, and let it fester inside. I wanted to help him, to tell him it was okay to feel, but how could I when he couldn't even admit the depth of his hurt to himself? When we reached our third year in junior high school, I started to hope things would change. Maybe, with time, he would find his strength. Maybe I wouldn't always have to fight his battles. But that hope shattered when the exam results came out. He had failed almost everything. I still remember the look on his face when he handed me his report card. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His failure wasn't just his, it was ours. The news hit me like a storm. He was going to be held back, and I was going to advance to the next grade without him. It wasn't just about the academics. I couldn't imagine a world where we weren't together. Who was going to protect him when bullies came? Who would sit beside him in class and remind him he wasn't alone? And how was I supposed to focus, knowing he might be suffering? I rushed to our class teacher, my heart pounding like a drum. "Repeat me too," I demanded. The words tumbled out before I could think them through. The teacher blinked at me in confusion. "What are you saying? You passed. You're moving up." "I don't care," I shot back, my voice cracking. "If he's staying, I'm staying." The teacher sighed, his expression softening. "You can't do that. You have a bright future ahead of you. Your brother will be fine. He has to learn to stand on his own 2 feet." Stand on his own 2 feet. The words felt like a slap. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him my brother wasn't ready, that he needed me. But deep down, I knew the teacher was right. My heart felt heavy as I walked out of that office, tears streaming down my face. For the first time, I couldn't protect him. One afternoon, we were walking home hand in hand, as we always did. It was a routine that had brought me comfort, a way to feel close to him, to protect him in whatever small way I could. The day was warm, the sun casting long shadows on the road ahead, and for a moment it felt like any other day. But life has a cruel way of twisting the ordinary into something tragic. As we approached the main road, the sound of passing cars filled the air. It was a busy stretch, one we crossed every day, and I instinctively tightened my grip on his hand. But this time, he pulled away. "Wait!" I called after him, but he didn't stop. He didn't even hesitate. He stepped onto the road, his small frame dwarfed by the chaos of speeding cars. A sickening sense of dread washed over me as I saw the headlights of a car barreling toward him. The vehicle was coming too fast, and for a fleeting moment, I thought he might stop or run back, but he didn't. Instead, he turned his head to look at me, his face calm, almost resigned. "No!" I screamed, my voice raw with desperation. The driver slammed on the brakes, the screeching sound piercing the air, but it was too late. The car struck him, the force of the impact sending him flying before his small body crumpled onto the asphalt. Everything after that was a blur. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the sound of my screams muffled by the rush of blood in my ears. I remember running toward him, but my legs felt like lead. I remember someone pulling me back, their arms strong and unyielding. My brother was gone, just like that. I cried like a baby, my sobs tearing through the air as I fought against the arms holding me. Let me go, I screamed. But the stranger, someone who knew us, though I couldn't recognize him, lifted me onto his shoulder and carried me home. His voice was gentle, murmuring words I couldn't understand, but I didn't care. I didn't want comfort. I wanted my brother. At home, the silence was deafening. I sat in a corner, my knees drawn to my chest, as people moved around me, their voices hushed with pity. I couldn't look at anyone. My chest ached as though my heart had been ripped from it, and in a way, it had. The funeral came and went in a haze. I stood by the grave, my fists clenched so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. I watched as they lowered him into the ground, the finality of it hitting me like a blow. When it was all over, I went home and locked myself in our shared room. I gathered all his belongings, his books, his clothes, the little trinkets he kept hidden under his pillow, and packed them into his bag. His scent lingered on the fabric, a painful reminder of the boy who would never come back. I zipped the bag shut and held the keys in my trembling hands. This bag held everything that was left of him, everything that mattered. I couldn't bring myself to throw anything away. Instead, I shoved the bag under my bed and vowed never to open it. The keys became my treasure. I wore them around my neck, a constant reminder of my brother. They were my way of keeping him close, even as the world moved on. But the world did move on, even though mine had stopped. And with each passing day, I had to learn how to live in a world without him, a world where I no longer had someone to protect, someone to fight for, a world where I was truly alone. 10 years had passed since my brother's death, but the ache in my heart never truly faded. Life moved on, as people always said it would, but his absence remained a hollow space I couldn't fill. I grew older, carrying the weight of memories and regrets, always wondering if there was more I could have done to protect him. One afternoon, while cleaning out the room we had once shared, I found his old bag, the one I had locked away all those years ago. The keys had hung around my neck for so long that I had forgotten they were there, more a part of me than just an object. With trembling hands, I opened the bag. The scent of old paper and faded memories greeted me, and I pulled out his belongings one by one. Clothes that no longer smelled like him, small trinkets that once held meaning, and then, at the very bottom, a notebook. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the room growing quiet as I opened it. The first pages were filled with lyrics of songs he had written. I had no idea he had this creative side. He had always been so quiet, so private. The lyrics were raw and full of emotion, and I couldn't help but hear his voice in my head as I read them. But as I flipped through the pages, the songs stopped. What came next was something else entirely. Journal entries. He had written about his days, about things that had happened to him. For 3 days, I sat in that room, devouring his words. Each entry felt like a conversation with the brother I had lost, a window into his world. He wrote about the fights I had fought for him, the bullying he endured, and the guilt he felt for not being stronger. His words were full of pain, but also of love. He had always been grateful for me, even though he never said it aloud. Then, on the 3rd day, I reached an entry that stopped me cold. I don't know why he keeps coming every night to sleep with me. Even when I use my dead mom's name to beg him, he doesn't listen. My hands shook as I read the words. My breath hitched, and I felt my chest tighten as though the air had been stolen from the room. He had written Uncle Fred's name, the same Uncle Fred who had taken us in, who had promised to care for us when we had no one else. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I read them again, hoping, praying that I had misunderstood. But the truth stared back at me, unrelenting. My brother had been suffering in silence, enduring horrors I had never imagined, and I hadn't known. The guilt hit me like a tidal wave. I had promised to protect him, to fight his battles, and yet the worst battle of all had been one I didn't even see. Memories flooded back, His quietness, his refusal to speak up, the way he would cry at night when he thought no one could hear. It all made sense now, in the most horrifying way. He had been trying to survive something unspeakable, and I hadn't been there to save him. The notebook slipped from my hands as I buried my face in my knees, sobbing uncontrollably. My mind raced with questions. How long had it been happening? Did anyone else know? Did anyone else turn a blind eye? I sat there for hours, clutching the notebook to my chest, my brother's pain now my own. I thought about confronting Uncle Fred, about exposing him for what he had done, but fear held me back. What if no one believed me? What if his crimes went unpunished, just as they had for so many years? That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My brother's words echoed in my mind, and for the first time in a decade, I felt his presence beside me, urging me to do something. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about justice, for him, for me, and for the child I couldn't protect. As I continued to read, the words grew darker, more chilling, every time my uncle's name appeared. He said he'll send me to join my mom if I tell anyone. The handwriting was shaky, as though he had written it in fear, his small hand trembling under the weight of his secret. I could picture him sitting in the dark, pen in hand, pouring out the words he couldn't say aloud. I can't sleep. I'm scared. Each entry felt like a knife cutting deeper into my heart. He had been so young, so vulnerable, and the one person who was supposed to protect us had been the one to destroy him. The pieces began to fall into place, the quietness, the way he flinched at loud voices, his refusal to look adults in the eye. He had been carrying a weight far too heavy for his small shoulders, and I had missed it. By the time I closed the final page, my chest felt hollow, my hands numb. Tears streamed down my face as I stared at the notebook, its cover worn and faded from time, but its contents burning like fresh wounds. And then the realization hit me like a thunderclap. It wasn't an accident. The memory of that afternoon came rushing back, vivid and raw. The way he had let go of my hand, the way he had walked into the road, turning to look at me just before the car hit him. That look, it wasn't fear, it wasn't confusion, it was goodbye. He hadn't been careless or unaware. He had made a choice to escape the darkness that had consumed him, to take a shortcut out of a life he could no longer bear. My knees buckled under the weight of the realization, and I collapsed to the floor, clutching the notebook to my chest. The sobs came uncontrollably, ripping through me like waves crashing against jagged rocks. It felt as though I had lost him all over again, but this time the pain was sharper, more unbearable. I had thought I knew grief when he died. I thought I had mourned him, but now the grief was different. It wasn't just about losing him. It was about the torment he had endured, the loneliness he must have felt, and the ultimate decision he had made to leave it all behind. For hours, I sat there, rocking back and forth, the notebook still in my hands. His words echoed in my mind, haunting me. He said he'll send me to join my mom if I tell anyone. But he didn't need Uncle Fred to send him. He had done it himself. I cried until my body had no more tears to give, until the room grew dark, and the world outside seemed as still as the pain inside me. How could he? How could Uncle Fred, the man who had promised to take care of us, betray us in such a vile, unforgivable way? My fists clenched as I thought of all the times he had laughed with us at the dinner table, the times he had patted my brother on the back like a loving uncle. It was all a lie. I knew I had to do something. Staying silent would mean letting my brother's suffering die with him, and I couldn't live with that. He deserved justice. That evening, I went to see Uncle Fred. My heart pounded as I clutched the notebook in my trembling hands, the words I had rehearsed swirling in my mind. The house hadn't changed much in 10 years. Same worn-out furniture, same faint smell of wood smoke, but the man sitting in his favorite chair wasn't the same to me. "Uncle Fred," I said, my voice steady, but my insides shaking. He looked up from his newspaper, smiling as if nothing had happened. "Ah, it's been a while. How are you, my dear?" I dropped the notebook onto the table between us. The smile faded from his face. "Do you recognize this?" I asked, my voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. He stared at it, then at me. "What is this?" I flipped it open to the page with his name. His eyes scanned the words, and for a moment I saw something flicker across his face. Fear, guilt, or perhaps just the realization that his secrets were no longer safe. "You did this to him," I said, my voice breaking. "You did this, and he couldn't take it anymore. He's dead because of you." Uncle Fred's hands trembled, but he quickly masked it with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. "That boy was troubled. Don't you dare," I interrupted, my voice rising. "Don't you dare blame him for what you did." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. For a moment, it seemed like he might deny it again, but then his shoulders slumped. "What do you want from me?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Justice," I said, my eyes burning with tears. "You stole his life, and I won't let you get away with it." I left the house that night, determined to expose the truth. The first person I went to was Auntie Grace, Uncle Fred's wife. She had been like a mother to us after our mom died, and I believed she deserved to know. Her reaction was one of shock and disbelief. She stared at the notebook, her face pale. He did this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes," I said firmly, "and I need your help to make sure he pays for it." Together, we went to the police. Filing the report was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. I had to relive my brother's pain, recounting the details from his journal while trying to keep my composure. The officers listened carefully, their expressions grim. "We'll investigate this thoroughly," one of them assured me. The investigation that followed was long and grueling. Witnesses were interviewed, evidence was collected, and Uncle Fred was questioned. He denied everything at first, but the weight of the journal and other testimonies began to crack his defenses. The day of the trial felt surreal. Sitting in the courtroom, I felt a mix of fear, anger, and hope. Uncle Fred sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. As the prosecutor read excerpts from my brother's journal, I closed my eyes, trying to hold back tears. The words were like daggers, each one cutting deeper than the last. When the verdict finally came, I held my breath. Guilty. The word echoed in the room, and for the first time in years, I felt a weight lift from my chest. Uncle Fred was sentenced to prison, and though it couldn't bring my brother back, it felt like a step toward justice. After the trial, I visited my brother's grave. I knelt beside it, the notebook in my hands. "I did it," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I couldn't save you then, but I made sure he won't hurt anyone else." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment I felt a sense of peace. My brother's pain was no longer a secret, and though the scars of his loss would always remain, I knew I had done what he couldn't, spoken out. From that day forward, I vowed to dedicate my life to helping others like him, ensuring no one else had to suffer in silence.